I have been a judge for 38 years. I have seen grief walk through my courtroom in every shape it comes. Widows, orphans, mothers who lost children, fathers who lost everything. In 38 years, grief stops surprising you. You learn to recognize it. You learn to sit with it without flinching. But on April 3rd, 2025, at exactly 9:41 in the morning, a woman walked into my Los Angeles courtroom and sat down across from me, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Her name was Renee Carter, 44 years old, a home health aide, a mother of 2 boys, a widow of 11 days. She was wearing a dark blue blouse. Her hair was pulled back. She had a folder in her hands, not thick, not fancy, just a plain manila folder with papers inside. She set it on the table in front of her, folded her hands on top of it, and looked straight ahead. I noted the bruise first, left cheekbone, faded 4, maybe 5 days old, the kind of bruise that had been worse before it got to that stage. I noted the stillness second, the way she was holding herself, not nervous, not angry, not performing anything for the room, just completely, deliberately still. The way a person gets still when they have already been through the worst thing and they are not going to let anything crack them open again. I have seen that stillness before. It is not weakness. It is the opposite of weakness. The man sitting across from her was Thomas Greer, 61 years old, white, retired city contractor. He had an attorney, a man named Philip Cass from a firm in Glendale, pressed shirt, expensive watch, the kind of attorney hired by men who believe their money makes problems disappear. Thomas Greer was not nervous either. He was leaning back slightly in his chair, one hand on the table, the posture of a man who had spent his whole life walking into rooms and assuming they belonged to him. He glanced at Renee once, just once. The way you glance at something you have already decided does not matter. I watched all of this in the first 40 seconds. Then I called the case. And what I heard over the next 3 hours changed something in me that I did not expect to be changed. But before I take you into that courtroom, I need to take you back 11 days, back to a Tuesday evening in February, back to a road that Deshaun Carter had driven 1,000 times. Because this story does not start in my courtroom. It starts with a man named Deshaun Carter. And it starts with the question nobody was asking yet, the question that turns this entire case into something much darker than a $1,000 loan. Stay with me, because the answer is coming. And when it arrives, it is going to change everything you think you know about what happened on that funeral day. Deshaun Carter was 39 years old. He drove delivery trucks 6 days a week, sometimes 7. He left the house at 5 in the morning and came home at 7 at night and still found the energy to sit on the floor with his boys and help them with their homework. His older son, Malik, was 12. His younger son, Jordan, was 7. Renee told me later in my chambers, quietly, with her hands in her lap, that Deshaun never missed a single parent-teacher conference. Not one. In 12 years, he was a good man. I want you to understand that clearly, because in this story, there are people who tried very hard to make him into something smaller than what he was. But Deshaun Carter and his family were struggling, the kind of struggling that is invisible from the outside. They paid their bills most of the time. They kept the lights on most of the time. But there was no cushion, no savings account, no room for anything to go wrong. In November of 2024, something went wrong. Renee's hours got cut. The family she was caring for moved out of state. Suddenly, their income dropped by 30%. The rent was due. The boys needed winter clothes. Malik had a school trip coming up that he had been talking about for months. Deshaun did not want to ask anyone. That was the kind of man he was proud, quietly proud. The kind of pride that does not announce itself but sits deep in a person's chest and does not bend easily. But he was running out of options. And that is when Thomas Greer offered. Greer had lived 3 streets over for 15 years. He knew the neighborhood. He knew the faces. He had always been, and I am choosing this word carefully, watchful, the kind of neighbor who noticed things, who kept track, who made it quietly, consistently clear through 15 years of small moments that he did not think his Black neighbors were quite his equals. Not loudly, not with slurs on the street, with things smaller than that. The way he never learned to say Deshaun's name right after 15 years. The way he spoke to Renee like she worked for him whenever they crossed paths. The way he once told a city inspector, casually, that the neighborhood had changed, and the inspector had nodded like he understood exactly what that meant. When Deshaun mentioned he was short on rent, Greer offered $1,000 on the spot. No paperwork, no interest discussed. Just here. Pay me back when you can. Deshaun hesitated. Renee told me he came home that night and sat at the kitchen table for a long time before he told her about it. She said he didn't trust it. He just didn't have another choice. They took the money, and from that day forward, Thomas Greer changed. The casual friendliness disappeared. He started calling Deshaun to check on the repayment. Once a week, then twice, then more. He started making comments, small ones, always deniable, about people who borrowed and never paid back, about responsibility, about certain kinds of people. Deshaun never said anything back. He just kept working, kept trying to get the money together. On February 20th, 2025, a Tuesday evening, Deshaun Carter was driving home from a late delivery. He was on a road he had driven 1,000 times. At an intersection 2 miles from his house, a car ran a red light at 60 miles an hour. The paramedics arrived in 4 minutes. They worked on him for 11 minutes on the side of the road. Deshaun Carter was 39 years old. He did not make it. Renee got the call at 8:17 p.m. Malik and Jordan were already in bed. She sat on the kitchen floor for 20 minutes before she could stand up again. And 3 days later, while she was still making funeral arrangements, while she was still explaining to a 7-year-old why his father was not coming home, Thomas Greer called her. He said, "I need my money back." That was 3 days after her husband died. 3 days. And what happened next at that funeral home in front of everyone is something that should not exist in any version of this world. But it did exist. I know it existed because I read every witness statement. I read the police report. I watched Renee Carter sit across from me and tell me every detail in a voice so controlled it was almost frightening. Here is what Thomas Greer did. And here is where this story becomes something none of you were prepared for. The funeral was on February 26, 2025. Renee had arranged it at Mitchell's funeral home on Crenshaw Boulevard. Deshaun's mother had come in from Georgia. His 2 brothers drove overnight from Phoenix. The church community was there, neighbors, co-workers who had driven delivery routes with him for years. The room was full. Malik sat in the front row in a suit that was slightly too big for him. Jordan sat next to his grandmother and held her hand the whole time. He did not fully understand yet, not completely. He kept looking at the door. The casket was open. Deshaun Carter was dressed in the Navy suit he had worn to Malik's 5th grade graduation. Renee had chosen it herself. Thomas Greer arrived at 10:47 in the morning. He was not on the guest list. He had not been invited. He walked through the front door of that funeral home like he belonged there, like it was a place he had every right to be, and he walked directly to the open casket. He did not bow his head. He did not pause. He stood over Deshaun Carter's body and looked down at him. Then he kicked the casket stand. The casket shifted. People heard it, a hard, deliberate thud, and the room went silent in the way rooms go silent when something deeply wrong has just happened and no one's brain has caught up yet. Renee jumped to her feet. Thomas Greer turned to the room and said, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "This man isn't going anywhere. Nobody is carrying him to any graveyard until I get my money back." He said it about a man in a casket, a dead man, a father. He pointed at Deshaun Carter's body and he used words. I will not repeat them in full. They are in the police report, signed by Officer Kevin Barnes, witnessed by 14 people, words that reach back to the worst chapters of this country's history. Words that said, without any ambiguity, that he had never seen Deshaun Carter as a man. Jordan was standing 4 feet away. He was 7 years old. He saw everything. Renee stepped forward. She told Greer to leave. She told him quietly, carefully, with everything she had that she would handle alone, that this was not the time, that he needed to leave her husband's funeral. Thomas Greer called her a dog, the same word he had used about Deshaun, in front of the casket, in front of her children, in front of Deshaun's mother, who was 71 years old and had driven from Georgia to say goodbye to her son. Then he slapped her, open hand, across the left side of her face, hard. The room heard it. Malik stood up from his chair. He was 12 years old, and he stood up and took a step toward Greer, and Renee grabbed her son's arm and held him back. She told me later that holding Malik back, keeping her 12-year-old from going after a grown man who had just hit his mother at his father's funeral was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life. Harder than the phone call, she said. Harder than telling Jordan. That was the hardest moment. Someone called 911. Officer Kevin Barnes arrived in 6 minutes. Greer was still in the building. He had not left. He was standing near the door telling people that Renee owed him money, and he was not leaving until someone promised he would get it back. He was not arrested that day. The responding officer cited it as a civil dispute, documented the slap, documented the statements, told Greer to leave. Greer left, but he was not done. In the days that followed, the calls started every day, sometimes twice a day. Threatening messages left on her phone, notes left on her car. He told neighbors she was a thief. He told one neighbor, and this is in a sworn statement, that Deshaun had deserved what happened to him because men like him always ended up like that. And then on March 8th, 12 days after the funeral, at 11:14 at night, Thomas Greer called Renee Carter's phone and told her he would kill her if she did not return his money by the end of the week. She recorded it, the whole call, 41 seconds. She filed that recording with the Los Angeles Police Department the next morning. She filed a restraining order. And 3 days after that, she walked into the clerk's office and filed a civil case. She did all of this while working, while raising her sons alone, while grieving. Now, I want to stop here for a moment, because when Renee Carter walked into my courtroom, Thomas Greer's attorney had filed 2 motions to dismiss before we even had a hearing date. He called it a neighborhood dispute. He said the slap was an involuntary reaction to provocation. He said the phone call had been taken out of context. Out of context. I want you to hold that phrase. Because when I finally got Thomas Greer on the record in my courtroom, when I asked him to explain himself, what he said was something I was not prepared for. And neither was anyone else in that room. Hey, before I go further with this story, I want to take 1 second right now. Wherever you are watching this from, drop your city in the comments. I genuinely want to know how far this story has traveled. People are watching from all over the world, and that matters to me. This story deserves to be heard everywhere. And if you have not subscribed yet, hit that button right now. I have 4 more cases coming this month, and every single one of them is as real, as serious, and as important as this one. You do not want to miss them, okay? Back to my courtroom, back to Thomas Greer, back to the moment he decided right there in front of me that he could say whatever he wanted to anyone in that room. I let Renee present first. She was precise, composed. She walked me through every document the way a person walks through something they have rehearsed 100 times, not because they are performing, but because they needed to know it perfectly to survive it. The 911 call log from the funeral home, Officer Barnes's report, signed and dated, the 14 witness statements, her phone records showing Greer's calls, 17 of them, between February 27th and March 8th. The recording of the death threat, the medical record documenting the bruise on her cheekbone, photographed 3 days after the funeral by her primary care physician. She had everything, every single thing, organized, dated, in order. When she got to the part about Jordan, about her 7-year-old standing 4 feet away when she was slapped, her voice dropped slightly, not breaking, just quieter, like she was protecting something that mattered too much to say loudly. I noted it. Then it was Thomas Greer's turn. His attorney argued it was a civil debt dispute. The slap was disproportionately characterized. The phone call was hyperbolic frustration, not a credible threat. He used the word emotional 3 times to describe Renee as though grief at a funeral were a character flaw. I let him finish. Then I looked directly at Thomas Greer and I asked him one question. I said, Mr. Greer, did you go to Deshaun Carter's funeral on February 26th? He said yes. I said, were you invited? Pause. His attorney put a hand on his arm. Greer shook it off. He said, I had a right to be there. That man owed me money. I set my pen down. I said, Mr. Greer, a man is in a casket. His children are in the front row. His mother traveled from Georgia to be there. And your position is that a $1,000 loan gave you the right to walk into that room and do what you did? He looked at me directly, without blinking. And then he said something that made his own attorney close his eyes. He said, these people need to understand that debts have consequences. You borrow, you pay back. That's how it works. I don't care what day it is. These people, I have heard that phrase before. I heard it in this very breakdown earlier in this case file. Two words that carry 30 years of slow contempt in them. Two words that told me exactly who Thomas Greer was and exactly what he thought of every person in that funeral home. I said, Mr. Greer, I'm going to ask you to be very careful about what you say next, because everything in this courtroom is on the record. He said, I understand that. And I'll say this clearly. This whole proceeding is a waste of my time, and it's not going to be good for anyone involved, including you. The room went absolutely still. He had just threatened a sitting judge in open court, on the record, in front of his own attorney, who had gone the color of chalk. I looked at him for 4 seconds. I kept my face completely neutral. 38 years of practice. Then I said, thank you, Mr. Greer. I heard that. The record heard that. We'll come back to it. And I kept going because I had a ruling to deliver. And I had just received 30 minutes earlier in my chambers from a source I was not expecting information that changed the entire shape of this case. Information that Thomas Greer did not know I had. He was about to find out. Let me tell you about the note. Before the hearing began that morning, my clerk handed me a document. Not a note this time, a full 3-page letter delivered to my chambers by hand from the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Hate Crimes Unit. They had been watching Thomas Greer for 4 months, not because of Renee Carter, not because of Deshaun Carter's funeral, because of something that started with a complaint filed 9 months earlier by a family named the Washingtons, a Black family who had lived on the same street as Thomas Greer for 6 years. Over those 6 years, Greer had filed 29 complaints against them, noise violations, parking infractions, code enforcement calls about their fence, their garden shed, their children's basketball hoop in the driveway. 29 complaints, every single one of them investigated, every single one of them dismissed. No violation found, no noise, no infraction, nothing. A Latino family 2 doors down had received 11 complaints. Their guests were reported as suspicious persons so many times that 2 of their relatives coming to Sunday dinner had been stopped by police on the sidewalk in front of the house. The DA's office had built a pattern, documented, dated, cross-referenced with police dispatch logs. And then they found something else. 5 days before Deshaun Carter died, 5 days before that car ran a red light, Thomas Greer had made a phone call to his brother in Sacramento. The DA's office had that call, obtained legally under a warrant that had been in place for 6 weeks. In that call, Thomas Greer said, the delivery guy in the street owes me money. He's got nothing. His wife works part-time. They can't pay me back. But I'm going to make sure they know I can make their life very difficult. These people need to know their place. 5 days before Deshaun Carter died. Now, the DA's letter was careful. It did not draw a direct line between that phone call and the car accident. That was not what the letter said, and I am not saying it here. Deshaun Carter's death was a traffic accident. That is what the investigation found. That is the record. But here is what that phone call established legally, clearly, on record about Thomas Greer's state of mind and his intentions toward that family. He had already decided to make their life difficult. He had already framed them as people who needed to know their place. He had already told his brother they had nothing. And when Deshaun died, when the worst possible thing happened to that family, Thomas Greer did not pause, did not step back, did not feel anything that resembled humanity. He drove to the funeral home. And now here is the twist that nobody in that courtroom was prepared for. Halfway through the hearing, after I had excused everyone for a short recess and made 2 phone calls, I called the case back into session. Thomas Greer's attorney was preparing his closing summary. Greer was checking his phone. I said, Mr. Greer, before I deliver my ruling, I want to give you an opportunity to speak to something. He looked up. I said, on January 28th of this year, you made a phone call to your brother. During that call, you made statements about the Carter family. Are you aware that call was recorded under a lawfully obtained surveillance warrant by the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Hate Crimes Unit? The phone went face down on the table. His attorney stood up immediately, started talking about admissibility, about proper procedure, about the impropriety of introducing new evidence mid-hearing. I held up one hand. I said, counsel, sit down. I am not introducing this as evidence in this civil proceeding. I am informing your client that 2 representatives from the DA's office are currently in the hallway outside this courtroom, and they are not here for the civil case. Greer's attorney turned around and looked at the door. Then he looked at Greer. Then he looked at me. I nodded to my bailiff, Officer Patricia Holm. 8 years working my courtroom. She reads me perfectly. The doors open. 2 investigators from the Los Angeles County DA's Hate Crimes and Civil Rights Unit walked in. Both in suits, both with credentials out. They walked to the defendant's table without hurrying, without rushing, the way people walk when they have all the time in the world and the other person has none. The lead investigator, Detective Sarah Millard, stopped in front of Thomas Greer. She said, "Mr. Greer, you are being placed under formal investigation and remanded for processing on charges, including felony criminal threats, racially motivated harassment under California Penal Code 422.6, and civil rights violations across multiple documented incidents over 36 months. Please stand." Greer looked at his attorney. His attorney did not meet his eyes. He looked at me. I said nothing. I kept my face completely still. He looked at Renee Carter. She was sitting in her chair, completely still, hands folded on the table. She looked back at him. She did not look away. He stood slowly, like a man whose body understood what his mind was, still refusing to accept. They walked him out, and the courtroom erupted. But that was not the end, because what Thomas Greer said in the hallway, caught on the building's security audio, submitted to the court the following day, added 3 more months to what was coming for him. He looked back over his shoulder as he was being escorted out and said, loud enough for half the gallery to hear, "This isn't finished. You'll all regret this. On record, documented, witnessed. Some men cannot stop even when everything is over, even when the walls have already closed." Thomas Greer was one of those men. And that decision to say those words in that hallway was the last bad decision he would make as a free man for a very long time. I delivered my civil ruling that same afternoon. The parking and funeral home disturbance violation, guilty. Maximum civil penalty. The assault charged, the slap, documented by 14 witnesses, corroborated by medical photographs, confirmed by the responding officer's signed report, upheld in full, intentional, unprovoked, committed in the presence of minor children at a funeral service, intentional infliction of emotional distress, upheld. The phone calls, the notes, the threats, the comments to neighbors, the systematic harassment across 12 days following the funeral. Every single incident documented, dated, and submitted. The death threat, felony criminal threat under California law. I referred the full case file, including the DA's surveillance material, to the criminal court for immediate processing. Maximum civil damages, awarded in full to Renee Carter. I also stated for the record in open court, clearly, without softening a single word, that the actions of Thomas Greer on February 26th, 2025, at Mitchell's funeral home were not impulsive. They were not the result of frustration or grief or misunderstanding. They were deliberate. They were racially motivated. And they were committed against a woman who had just lost her husband and her children who had just lost their father. I said, this court finds that the defendant entered that funeral home with intent to intimidate, to degrade, and to harm. The debt he claims to have been owed does not exist in any legal or moral framework as justification for what occurred in that room. Not for 1 second of it. The room was quiet. I looked at Renee Carter. She was looking down at the table. Then she looked up at me. She nodded, the quiet kind, the kind that cost something to give. Now, the criminal case, Thomas Greer's trial took place 4 months later before Judge Patricia Owens in Los Angeles Superior Court. I followed every day. The prosecution was methodical, devastating. First, the phone call to his brother, played in open court. The jury heard him say, these people need to know their place 5 days before showing up at a dead man's funeral to demand money. Second, the 29 documented complaints against the Washington family, the 11 complaints against the Latino family. Officers who had responded to those calls testified. Every single complaint dismissed. No violation found, ever. In 36 months. Third, the 14 witnesses from the funeral home, one by one. Deshaun's mother testified. She was 71 years old, and she sat in that witness chair and described watching a man kick her son's casket. The jury heard every word. And then the twist, on the third day of trial, the prosecution called one final witness that nobody in that courtroom expected. Thomas Greer's own brother, the man who had been on the other end of that January phone call. His name was Robert Greer, 58 years old. And he had done something that Thomas Greer, even in all his arrogance, had not anticipated. He had called the DA's office voluntarily 2 weeks after the arrest. He had walked in and asked to speak to Detective Millard because Robert Greer had kept records of his conversations with his brother going back 2 years. Not because he had planned to use them, but because he testified he had become increasingly disturbed by what his brother was saying and doing, and he had not known what to do about it. On the stand, Robert Greer testified that Thomas had spoken about the Carter family multiple times over a period of months, that he had called Deshaun Carter the delivery boy every single time, that he had talked about the $1,000 loan not as money he needed back, but as, in his words, leverage, that after Deshaun died, Thomas had called Robert and said, and the jury heard this directly, the delivery boy is gone. Now let's see what the wife does without him. The courtroom went absolutely silent. The delivery boy is gone, said the morning after Deshaun Carter died. The defense tried, they argued the phone calls were private conversations taken out of context, that Robert had misremembered, that the language used was unpleasant but not criminal. The jury listened to that argument. Then they listened to the recordings again. They deliberated for 9 hours. Guilty on every count. Felony criminal threats, 2 years. Racially motivated harassment under California penal, 3 years. Civil rights violations across 36 months of documented targeting, 2 additional years. The hallway thread added 6 months. Total, 7 years and 6 months. California State Prison, his pension from 30 years of city contract work under review for forfeiture pending the civil rights findings. His professional licenses permanently revoked. The civil judgment, Renee Carter had won maximum damages, was confirmed and ordered for immediate payment. He lost everything, the freedom, the reputation, the credentials, all of it gone. In the weeks after the verdict, I heard from Renee Carter. She came to my courthouse on her day off after a night shift. She asked if she could speak to me for 5 minutes. I said yes. She sat down across from me in my chambers. She looked tired. The kind of tired that does not come from one night, the kind that comes from carrying something unbearable for a very long time and finally being allowed to set it down. She said, I need you to know something. I didn't file that case because I thought I would win. I filed it because I needed someone in a room with authority to look at what he did to my husband and say that was wrong. That was not acceptable. That my husband's life and my husband's funeral and my children being in that room, that all of that mattered. I told her it did. I told her it always had. She told me that Jordan, her younger son, the 7-year-old, had asked her the night before the civil hearing whether she thought anything was going to happen, whether anyone was going to care. She had promised him yes. She said, I didn't know if I was telling him the truth. I just knew I couldn't say no to him. Then she told me something else, something I want to make sure you hear. She said that after the criminal verdict, she had been contacted by Thomas Greer's wife. The woman had called and said she was sorry, that she had not known how bad it had gotten, that she wanted to help Renee however she could, that the $1,000, whatever happened, Renee should consider it forgiven. Renee Carter listened to everything. Then she said, I appreciate you calling, but I mailed that money back in a certified envelope 3 weeks ago. I don't need it forgiven. I never needed the money. I needed my husband's funeral to be a place where my children could grieve in peace. Your husband took that from us. I forgive you personally, but I don't need anything from your family. She mailed the $1,000 from money she did not have. She went without for 10 days to do it. Because Renee Carter was not going to let anyone, not even a grieving wife trying to make amends, hold anything over her. Not a dollar, not a favor, not a single thread of obligation to the family that had done what it had done. That is dignity in its purest form. Now, here is what I want you to take from this story. Thomas Greer did not use a gun. He did not use a knife. He used a parking spot at a funeral, a phone call to a grieving widow, 2 words, these people, and the belief that a $1,000 loan gave him ownership over another human being's grief. He had done it slowly, for years. 29 complaints, 11 complaints, Small things, each deniable, each nothing on its own, until the day he walked into that funeral home and it was no longer small. And here's what stopped him. Not a dramatic moment, not a political movement, not a lawsuit with a team of expensive lawyers. One woman, a manila folder, 41 seconds of recorded audio, the decision to file a complaint while working night shifts and raising 2 sons alone and making breakfast every morning and getting up every single day and not letting it go. That is what justice actually looks like when it is not on television. It looks like Renee Carter sitting across from me with a bruise on her cheekbone and her hands folded on a folder and her voice completely steady. It looks like a mother promising her 7-year-old son that someone will care when she has every reason in the world to doubt it, and then going out and making that promise true. Thomas Greer is in a California state prison. He will be in his late 60s before he walks out. And on Renee Carter's mantle, next to a photograph of Deshaun in his Navy suit, there is a folded piece of paper. It is Jordan's most recent report card. He made the honor roll. Deshaun Carter never got to see it. But Renee Carter made sure the world that his son is growing up in is one where a man who kicked his father's casket is not walking free. That is the last gift she could give him. One woman, one folder, one decision, not to be silent. And it was enough.